Gambler's lucky streak. When we're out together, dancing cheek to cheek.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Piper Hendricks. I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you've joined us before, you know that our speaker chooses the song that welcomes you, and that one I'm grateful to Seth for selecting. It feels very peaceful today, and I can also imagine the two enlightenments that we'll be talking about dancing cheek to cheek. Ordinarily, this would be the time where I cheerily tell you about what Stories Change Power is and does, and ask you to put questions in the Q&A and so forth. Um, I'm feeling a bit heavier today in that I just heard that 3 friends have lost their jobs. One in the federal workforce, another kind of adjacent to that and impacted by those losses, and one in the private sector. All in slightly different circumstances, one the main breadwinner for his family. And it's just weighing a bit heavily. It led to a conversation with a friend, and I will give him credit for the smart things that he said, even though I can't cite him by name. We got to talking about how there's such a focus sometimes on productivity, and he mentioned and recognized how the American South, for example, used to be really productive when we dehumanized people through slavery. If you remember reading The Jungle in middle school or high school, we used to have really productive factories because we dehumanized people. There's a lot of prioritization, it feels like, of productivity over people and profit over people. And if you pause and think about why, it's definitely not for ordinary people. And so, not to be, so heavy right now, but you've joined us for a talk about an absolutely amazing book. And I just want to be clear that we're not here talking about it as an intellectual exercise. And as Seth and I get into the conversation, I really want to keep people at the forefront, because if not for people, why are we all here? So with that, I'll turn to introduce today's speaker. We'll do our poll as usual and get into the conversation. As always, your questions are very, very welcome. Please do put those in the Q&A, and all the other things that I usually say, I'll skip that today. We are joined by Seth David Radwell, who is an internationally known business executive who earned his master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government. Building on years and years of research, he wrote American Schism, which is an investigative tracing of our nation's divergent roots. And the book recently earned the International Book Award for Best General Nonfiction. Seth believes our democracy is in crisis today and will remain so as long as we allow the extreme ends of the partisan spectrum to dominate our political debate. Happily, his research points to a magic formula, which we have historically used to overcome major divisions, but which we have discarded today at our own peril. Seth has served in many executive roles over the course of his career, including as the CEO of the Proactiv Company, the leading skincare brand for acne, until 2018. Seth, thank you for joining us today and for making the time to be part of this conversation. And as Seth comes on screen and off mute, we'll turn to a poll. We've got 3 questions today, so I invite you to get ready to enter your answers in on the screen, or if it's easier for you to do that in the chat. Our 3 questions: number 1, how familiar are you with the history of the Enlightenment? You've got 4 options there. Vary. Maybe some of you could teach a high school course on it tomorrow. Some of you might be fairly familiar, but the details are a little bit fuzzy. Third, somewhat you remember hearing about enlightenments, but none of the details. Or your 4th option there is enlightened what? Question 2, how familiar are you with the current movement to rebuild trust and bridge current divides in our country? 4 options there as well. Vary, maybe you're involved with it every day. Fairly, you're involved monthly. Maybe somewhat, you've heard of it, but you're not closely involved. And then for some of you, it might be news that there is such a movement. And last question, do you think that America is more divided today than in previous eras? First option, you think we've always been divided. Second, we've had eras in which we were more divided in the past than we are now. Third, our current divisions are among the most serious in our history. Or fourth, we've never been so divided since the Civil War. I'm seeing a lot of answers come in. If you've not put those into the chat just yet, please go ahead and do so. Seeing some movement here. Let's give folks another maybe 3, 2, 1, and then we'll go ahead and end the poll. And I'll share the results here. You'll see that many folks are somewhat familiar with the Enlightenment. They remember learning about it, but really none of the details. So Seth, we may need to do a refresher today. Many of you, this is great to see, about 40% are involved in the current movement to rebuild trust and bridge current divides. If that's news to you or you're not as involved, in our next newsletter from Stories Change Power, we will be sharing more about that and ways for you to get involved in your own community. And then I see a lot of variety on the last question here, folks divided about how divided we've been. So let's go ahead and move into our conversation. Thank you everybody for responding here. And Seth, I'd love to ask some questions here. If we can, there we go. We'll get you on the screen and then we'll
Hello.
pin. Hello, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and pin both of us here for our conversation. And so Seth, I want to start before I'll leave a little suspense on that last poll question as to what the correct answer is. But this book was a personal journey for you, including some unraveling of really deeply seated views. Before we get into the content of it, can you share a little bit about what shifted for you and what inspired you to write American Schism?
Sure. Well, I think the most relevant point is that while I studied public policy and a lot of history and philosophy in college and grad school, my entire career for the last 35 years has been in business. I've been CEO of various brands in the skincare space and the personal product space, before that in publishing. So I made a conscious decision about 5 years ago to leave my career to go on this journey. And I would say, Piper, there are two parts to it. The first part is, over the course of the first Trump administration, I was alarmed at how much our civic discourse had collapsed and the degree to which rancor and acrimony had replaced rational discussion. So as a citizen, that of course was alarming. But that alone, I don't think would have made me do this work. What made me get off my side and get involved in this was that I started to notice that my peers, fellow CEOs, and my career has been long enough that I remember how CEOs reacted to tough civic issues 25 years ago. And there was a huge change. Meaning 25 years ago, when I was with McKinsey in my early career, CEOs and private sector leaders in general were very open to engaging on civic issues or public policy issues. Whereas in recent years, CEOs are putting their heads in the sand, very afraid to engage. And to me, that was very alarming, because I thought if the public sector discourse has collapsed and if private sector leaders won't engage, we're in trouble as a society. Now, when I started this journey in 1819, I thought we were in trouble. I think it's much more severe now. And so I do believe that we are in a situation where we're kind of at a tipping point. We are likely, unless things change in a different way, we will not be able to bestow to our children the democratic republic that we're used to.
Yes. And that I want to get into the solution that you set forth in your book. Let's first though turn to that last final poll question. As a reminder, everybody was pretty split between the 4 options. Can you tell us what was the right answer?
The right answer is, and by the way, just the background here is that what in my research and the work I did at investigative in American Schism, the book, is in fact an investigative tracing of the history of our polarization. So that's exactly what I studied. And the answer is we've been divided at many points in our history. So whether I think this is one of the most polarized periods we've ever had. Certainly, maybe not as much as the Civil War, but it would rank in some of the most polarized times we've had. But what's more important to me is not that whether it's the most polarized or divided we've ever been. What's more important is that when you go through the tracing, the investigative work that I've done, I think you can tease out what I call a secret sauce or a magic formula for how at times in the face of division, we've been able to transcend differences and move forward. And we have done that successfully when we've used these elements of the secret sauce. At times when we haven't used them, we've had much worse outcomes, like the Civil War. And I think that the alarming thing today is we've abandoned those ingredients, which I think we'll get into why we're not using kind of the tools we have, the tools that history shows us. So history can act as a salve for our wounds if only we'd apply it.
Yep. Amen. And we will absolutely get into what the elements are and how to apply them. I want to dig a little bit, though. You said that in the book, we're seeing ourselves now living in two different stories. And that's a big focus for us at Stories Change Power. You know, the narrative, the larger narrative, the stories we're telling ourselves. You mentioned that we're living both in a partisan bubble and a time bubble. What does that mean?
Sure. Well, I think hopefully most listeners realize and have read a lot about this partisan bubble or tribal bubbles. We're all, because of the way media is structured and how much of our interaction with our fellow citizens is not in person, but is through digital media. We have sequestered ourselves in our cocoons where we feel comfortable and where we hear stories that confirm our biases, because that's how media is divided up now, as well as we kind of reaffirm what we think is true. So in other words, we're in our own narrative, and there are many other narratives that are not consistent with that. Now, so that's why we're in what I call a partisan bubble. Some call it a tribal bubble. Hopefully, many of the folks on the conference today have talked about that and are aware of it. I think there's another bubble that's equally as important, which is the time bubble. And what I mean by that is we seem to forget that most of the issues that we're dealing with today have antecedents in our history, and they've come up before, and we rarely talk about how we've dealt with them in history. For example, I mean, one of the greatest examples of this is January 6th. This was not the first time there was an armed insurrection in our country. We've had, I'm going back to Shays Rebellion, we've had many. And if you look at the history of these, the Whiskey Rebellion as well, it teaches us a lot. So I say a time bubble because we're not using the lessons of our own history to help us understand where we are today.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And a lot of us learn history as if it's a quaint something way back then that is more of something to be tested on rather than to actually realize how it's impacting us today and have any lessons drawn from that, especially where, you know, we can tell ourselves we live in such a different era. In some ways we do. Back then they didn't have internet, they didn't have social media, they didn't have AI. And yet there's still the same principles that can apply today. So this is a tough question given how long and thorough the book is, but for those who haven't read it, can you give us a summary of what you cover?
Sure. The bottom line, or the key thesis, if you will, is that we will not be able to understand why we're so divided today, why our polarization is so severe, unless we understand the roots from which it's come. And in fact, I argue that the roots of our division today is really derivative of a first split, an original American schism, if you will, that happened during our founding between two very different versions of what, during the Enlightenment, what were thought of as the social contract. So our founders had very different notions of what America, this new country, would be. And just to spend a second on it, I mean, on one hand, you had people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and their model was very much the British, what was called at the time an aristocratic republic. So that model, really going back to the Magna Carta, was based on the idea that educated people, nobles, the high crust of society, it was their responsibility to govern on behalf of the people, to keep the king, the monarch, in control. And, you know, whether that was very Lockean, so that we have these inalienable rights and Locke called them liberty and property. And as well, so that we'll talk about that in a minute. The right to liberty and property and justice, things like that. In that model, Alexander Hamilton and Adams and their followers eschewed democracy. They didn't believe, they were very afraid that democracy meant the mob and meant that irrational emotions would govern the republic. So they very much believed in this aristocratic model, which today we would call the elite side of, the elite establishment is very much the current version of that. On the other hand, other founders of ours, namely Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine, all spent much time in Paris and were much more influenced by the French Enlightenment than the British one. And here, people like Diderot and Condorcet, they maintain that the only sustainable form of social contract would be a democratic representative government where the people, even though they may not all be educated today, ultimately elect representatives to advocate on their behalf. So the idea of democratic representation was, in fact, one side of this original schism. Now, why is this important? It's important because, in fact, those two sides are very much at play today, although we don't often talk about it in those terms, which we'll come back to. But the other reason it's important is that I mentioned before a secret sauce, but if you watch the period from 1776 to 1787, when the Constitution was written, and there's a full section of the book on this, there was an amazing process by which we figured out how to weave between those two models. And one of the weavers, one of the great figures who was able to bring them together, of course, was James Madison, who penned a lot of the Constitution. But if you look, for example, today at why is the Federalist Papers such an important political treatise? It's so, and it was originally written, by the way, many panelists may know this, I mean, many of the participants, as a marketing document so that the Constitution would be adopted. But it's very important today because, in fact, in the Federalist Papers, you see how our blueprint, our Constitution, is a blend that tries to incorporate the benefits of the aristocratic model as well as the representative democracy model. So it's kind of a mixed model, and that's why we had a House which was elected by the people, but at the time both the president and the Senate were not elected by the people. And so there are elements of both. And famously in Federalist 10, Madison eloquently explains how this blueprint is trying to balance the tensions of the two. So I'll stop there. But the point is, after setting up that original schism and looking at it, I go through 5 periods of our history discussing how it played out, and then, of course, bring it to today, which is what we'll probably spend more time covering.
Yep. Yeah, I really appreciate that what you're saying, because going back to how we tend to learn our history, there's this nice, neat, chapter or two, and then we carry forward as if there's a shared vision from the get-go, and understanding that there was a separation, and we've been navigating both for our entire history is a very different way of looking at it. And I think you'll appreciate, if folks can see the logo behind me, our 2 swoops are meant to show there are 2 different stories, 2 different ways of seeing the world, and it's based on the 2 loops model, whereas one starts to deteriorate, much like normal seasons of the world, and as they deteriorate, there's a new loop beginning underneath, something more hopeful, a different way of looking at the world. And there are folks who will fight that, wanting to say, well, we can't, change isn't possible, and then meanwhile other folks are already on that new loop. So
Right.
I'm eager to get to that. But I do want to say, so another theme through the book is a call for a system that supports opportunity for everyone, instead of something that's only a few, for those elite, for the minority, in the sense of economic wealth and social capital. Why is it, Seth, that so many years after the Enlightenment, we're still so far from a system that promotes thriving together with no exceptions?
Yeah, this is a great question, Piper. There were 2 major thrusts in my answer here. The first is that the Enlightenment's got a bad rap over the last 50 years for a whole bunch of reasons. But we forget how powerful the concepts of the Enlightenment were. In fact, I could go into detail, but suffice to say that thanks to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, I would say we've had more prosperity, human prosperity, in the last 250 years than in the prior 2000. And if you don't believe me, look at some objective facts. 250 years ago, life expectancy was around 35 years old. Today, it's, of course, much more than that all over the globe. We could look at other figures like that. So this prosperity comes out of a movement that fundamentally unleashed the potential for human capacity, which is what the Enlightenment in my study, with my mind, is. And so we reject that, its foundings, its principles, with great peril. And so that's why I think, when I mentioned opportunity for all, which you're talking about, so I feel like we're moving away from the principles, our inheritance from the Enlightenment today. Now, how does that relate to opportunity? Let me say this. If you think about why America has become the envy of the world over the last 100 years, I would argue it's not because of our military strength. It's not because of our high GDP, although those certainly play a role. But there are two factors that really drive why America has become something so desirable as for other citizens of the world. The first one is that despite all of our problems and our difficulties, we're still the best example of self-governance that's ever existed in the modern era. And the second, and this is what relates to your point, we are a place where, despite your background, even if you're not born noble, even if you're from a poor family, the concept, the myth, if you will, is that if you come here and work hard, you can be successful. And that notion of meritocracy, I think, is fundamental to our ethos, to what our credo is all about. So I get into that in the book in a big way. But I think another side trend, along with this rejection of the Enlightenment, is America abandoning its principles about what a meritocracy requires. So that's a big theme as well that I talk about. And I don't want to take up too much time now, but because I want to get to questions. But if folks are interested in that, in addition to the book, I have a Substack that I write a monthly column on, so that's also available.
Yeah, and we'll share a link to that during the webinar as well. I realize, and I think we may have been a little, you mentioned the two stories, but can you a bit more explicitly say there were the two different enlightenments? Can you name those?
Sure. So in the book I call, well, this is always tricky because terms can be weird. In the book I call them the moderate enlightenment and the radical enlightenment. The radical being the Jeffersonian model of embracing what at the time was very feared, which is a democratic republic. Now, those terms were not mine. One of the great historians of the Enlightenment is a guy named Jonathan Israel, who, by the way, wrote the intro to the book. And he's come up with this framework that I adopt. So I often don't get into why they're called that, because terms like radical, they can be very, very, John Adams was a radical because he wasn't a loyalist. So those are relative terms. But the point is, as I outlined, this notion of what the democratic republic should be, this kind of aristocratic model versus this decentralized democratic model. Those two different models are what drove it. So yes, I think that's the core. And of course, your question suggests, like, what does that mean today? I think today it's fundamentally the tension between elite governance and, on one hand, which has served us well in building American institutions, which would be corresponding to the Hamiltonian, like devising all of the solutions to problems. On the other hand, I would say that a majority of Americans today no longer trust these institutions. And the concept is what we sometimes call popularism, or this movement to reject the elite establishment, is also very important, but comes out of the other side of this schism. So that's how they manifest today.
And it's interesting, what I hear you saying is if you look over the course of human history, we are overall, safer, living longer, healthier, and all that, which is sometimes easy to forget, but it's like this rising tide in a way has lifted all boats, but certainly not equally, where there's some, like if you look at snapshot today, folks who are incredibly wealthy, and that division in income and well-being is pretty stark. So with that, I'd love to get into, you can tell us the special sauce. What's the formula?
Good, I'll do it. One thing I want to just also mention, because you triggered this, when you look at where we are, what's the manifestation of the schism today, and why do I say that it has become so important? Over the last 50 years, we in the US have led a global revolution in a new kind of political economic model, which is, we call it sometimes globalization. The technical term for economists is neoliberalism. And like all economic models, it has winners and losers. And I would say one of the great winners in this model has been China and India. I mean, in China, about 600 million, if not more, Chinese have risen out of poverty into the middle class, thanks to all we now manufacture there. So they've been a big winner. I think people who are tied into this global economy through information or services are also winners. But they've also been huge losers. People who traditionally worked in manufacturing, huge swaths of our country have been devastated for 3 generations. I think people are aware of it, so I won't get into it. But the point is, one way to gauge the schism today is that it's really a split between those Americans who've benefited from this economic model and those who've suffered under it. And that's why there's such a polarization today, in my view. Now, so I just wanted to get that out there. Let me answer your question. It's always difficult to describe the secret sauce in a minute or two because it's complex, but I will try, because I think this is really important. There are 3 elements that are most important to me. The first element of the secret sauce, again, this is the model that's helped us in our history. The first element is a commitment to using empirical evidence and data as a key part, essential to your problem-solving process. Data matters, and it can't be, we can't each have our own facts. We have to, we can have opinions, but we have to be able to look at empirical evidence and be able to be convinced that we were wrong. So the notion of empirical evidence or data driving the problem-solving process is one pillar of this. A second pillar is what I sometimes call deep empathetic listening. And it sounds trite, but it's a little bit like, certainly not the listening we do today. It's closer to what we did when we were kids in debate club, where to argue a case, you have to line up on both sides, the pro and the con, an understanding of both the logical argument and supporting evidence, as well as the emotional pull for a different point of view. So really getting in other points of view, getting into their shoes, so to speak. And we give very short shrift to this today. We're very quick to demonize other points of view without understanding them. So that's the second key element. And the third one, let me just say, is that when you go into a problem-solving process, knowing from the start that it will require compromise, that you will never get everything you want. So the notion of compromise has become a dirty word today, but unless you are willing to drive towards some level of compromise, and you know that going in, your problem-solving process won't work. So I think those 3 things, to simplify, would be the elements. Now, I would also say one overriding element fundamentally is about curiosity. I mean, we have to be curious about why our society could work better. If we don't have that innate curiosity, and I think that's another important issue. So I hope that was helpful to giving you a little high end of what those things are.
It's really helpful, and I'm seeing the parallels too when we talk about advocacy. I mean, absolutely being data informed. And unfortunately, I don't think this is news to anybody, where we live in a world where we are getting different, I'll put facts in parentheses, we're getting different stories. Some of them, we're at a point where things are completely made up out of whole cloth. And unfortunately, that's still reported in a way where people are being misguided, whether that's from more traditional news sources or social media. We have a lot of examples recently of, numbers of dollars suddenly warping as it's almost like a really bad game of telephone. So getting back down to those, like, do we have facts we can trust from trustworthy sources? I love what you're saying about the empathetic listening. Even as I wasn't on the debate team until late in college, I was horrible. So I have to draw my examples from elsewhere, but truly bringing that curiosity. And it almost feels like we're in an era that's just designed not to do that. It's social media where we're posting like, here's my fabulous vacation, or here's my stance on something. It's
Right.
not a space that naturally is open to that empathy and curiosity and vulnerability, but we need that, especially as advocates, to share authentic stories and have people understand, there's this policy in place. Maybe people thought that it, was well advised. Here's the actual impact, and here's what's happening. And then having that openness to change. And so I'm hearing what you're saying in all three of those, and I see where that applies to our advocacy. And I'd love to hear from you. So knowing those three things can be helpful, what's getting in our way, and what can we do to
Right.
get the secret sauce
Yeah.
back in
So I would
action?
say that there's one overall obstacle which we all share as Americans. I think we all believe in, or at least I'll talk. That's one. And then there are specific incentive problems that are based on how we've structured both media and the electoral process. So the overall problem that I think we all share is, and I'll say this as plainly as I can, our political governance model has become completely corrupt. It's driven by special interests who have the ear of legislators, um, uh, almost to the exclusion of many other interests of the populace. And that's why I say there's this tremendous distrust that's grown, or this rejection of the establishment. Now, I would say that it's gotten increasingly bad. I think we all know this to some degree, but unless we can change that system, this corrupt model, we're not going to be able to have a democratic republic. And so that's the overall problem. And another way to think about it is we've allowed those with economic power to
Mhm.
acquire all of the political power. And that's a recipe for disaster. And if you look, history also shows that. So that's the overall landscape. And probably one of the best books on this is Republic Lost by Larry Lessig. That was, I think, 10 years ago he wrote that.
Mhm.
So this is not I mean, many people have written about the nature of the corruption and why the system is so, with lobbyists in the center, how there's a entirely gift-oriented political economy around revolving door in Washington, and how it works, that's no longer serving people. Okay. Now, specifically, there are two actors in our political system today that have horrible incentives. The first are elected officials. Elected officials have realized a couple of cycles ago now that the best way of getting people to the polls is not rational arguments or using the secret sauce that I mentioned,
Mhm.
but it's by pushing buttons to get them afraid, angry, or fearful of their future. That amygdala-driven emotions,
Yeah.
pushing those rage buttons. That's what motivates voters to turn out. And that's always been true in politics, but it took a different turn, I think, starting with the Newt Gingrich era in Congress during Clinton's term, and it's progressively gotten worse than that. If you look back, you'd have to go back to the 19th century when we really demonized, when one side, quote unquote, really demonized the other to the degree we do now. So this notion of incentives for how to get elected is fundamentally broken, especially at the federal level. And I'll come back to how we could fix that. But there's a second actor that plays into this as well, which is the media. So the entire media model now is based on getting eyeballs or clicks, regardless of the journalistic ethos that is at the base of some of media. This is ironic because we built the journalism profession over the course of the last 100 years, largely in reaction to the media of the 19th century, which became increasingly what was called yellow journalism, sensationalist. But now the media model is entirely based on what it's programmatic, what information gets people to engage more. And there's no barometer, or very little barometer, let me say, for what's true or accurate. And so that media model driven towards sensational stories and continuing also to push people's buttons, if you will, that aligns with the electoral incentives. So those two incentive models are completely broken. And that creates what I sometimes call the paradox of the frustrated majority, which is that most of America, 70% of Americans agree on more than they disagree on basic things, 70%. But yet that majority, that frustrated majority, sometimes I call it the exhausted majority, it's been written a lot about, it feels like it's in the minority because the extremes get all the airtime, both in the political system and as well as in the media. So it feels like that the pragmatic problem solving and reason no longer have a space. And this frustrated majority has not been able to steal back the gavel from the lunatics on both ends. And that's been a real problem.
I want to underscore that just to be sure people can sit with that for a second, to recognize we do agree on more than we disagree, even though there's so many forces out there saying we're so polarized, we can't possibly come back together. And that there's a lot of research. We had a conversation actually last fall with James Cohen from More Like Us, talking about like we are more alike than we think. And there's a lot of people who are benefiting from making us feel like we are divided. And I think about that when you talk about, the brain science and the fear and how we're into that more lizard brain. One of the many beautiful things about storytelling is when you get into a space of more empathy, when you have a place where you can feel more connected, you're more relaxed. I mean, your brain chemistry literally changes. And so it just feels like such a contrast between the go, go, go of scrolling through an instant, news feeds and all the stuff that we're being hit with headlines wise today, to give ourselves that space to hear, or the ability for advocates to tell the stories so people can actually understand, getting away from that fear and the headlines into the real story and what's actually happening.
So yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right, Piper. And I think we're very familiar with how media does that by showing us stories that work us up and get us to click and engage more and spread them. But I'm not sure everyone is aware, besides kind of what I call the corruption and money in politics. On the electoral side, let me just use an example for the participants today. Let's say I'm a Republican congresswoman from Kentucky 6, and I'm fairly center right. And I dare, in my term, work with a Democrat on solving a problem using the secret sauce elements, let's say. In today's environment, the way it works is I will be challenged by someone on the right, and this happens on both sides, by the way, who's much more extreme and who's, let's say, abandoned the secret sauce, because their power comes from provoking these emotions that we talked about. Now, let's talk about that. So we're in Kentucky 6. Most states have closed primaries, and most districts are gerrymandered. So let's take those two things. 85% of the districts are sure. So that means all of a sudden that election day is no longer November. For those 85% of the districts, election day is in June during the primary. And with closed primaries, that means that the people who will show up for that Republican primary are a very small selection of the diehards in the party, because most independents can't vote, and a third of the voters are now independent. Democrats can't vote. So, if you look at the data, and some of the folks on the call have heard this before, but there was, I think Represent Us did a study of this in the 2022 cycle. If you try to guess, this was could be a poll as well, what portion of the electorate was responsible for electing 85% of our House seats? And since we don't have to do it as a poll, most people say like, oh, it's probably really bad, like 20%. The answer is it's about 8%. So we're allowing 8% of the voice of the electorate in June to elect 85% of our Congress seats. And think about that for a minute. That's an example of how the incentive in the electoral system don't work anymore in our environment.
And people looking at the federal level, the presidential election. I mean, I think a lot of people forget how many people who were eligible did not vote at all. So the numbers are really skewed. I think people feel disempowered. You know, why would I even bother if it feels like my voice isn't heard? Which I think is a perfect transition into, you know, let's be a little bit more hopeful here, Seth. What is your hope for American democracy? And what can ordinary, I'll say citizens, that's not meant to be, you know,
Right.
immigration status, but you know, people here, ordinary people. And then if you're in a place where you are an advocate with an organization, what would you tell folks to do?
Well, what I would say is, and this is ironic because probably most of the people listening to this call are aware of this, but we're at a very serious time. And again, as I mentioned at the start, I think what hangs in the balance is whether our open society model will sustain. And it's not just a U.S. thing, right? This is all happening all over the world. The autocratic model is winning, which we can talk about why, but it's a much more efficient model. So that's the stakes. Now, what you can do about it in the book and in my speaking, I advocate for kind of two paths that we all need to get involved in. Again, the frustrated majority needs to engage in these two paths,
Yeah.
which is all of us. I mean, many of us. What are those two paths? One are a set of structural election reforms that I think are very, frankly, fairly straightforward. Things like open primaries. We have to stop the gerrymandering. We have to have things like ranked choice voting. There are many particular structural reforms that would take away many of these incentives. It will take it away not only in terms of who wins an election, but frankly, it'll change the people who want to run. So if we change some of these
Yeah.
these incentives, more reasonable problem-solving candidates will emerge, okay, as opposed to extremists on both sides. So that's one path. Think of structural reform. The other side is what I sometimes call mindset and behavior changes, like recognizing that we can't treat citizens the way we half the country, whatever side you're on, half the country are not evil people. So that the notion of demonizing other points of view and having lost our ability to disagree respectfully, that is the other path. And so I work on both of these. On this behavioral mindset side, groups like Braver Angels, you may be familiar with. There are many groups that are trying to get, Braver Angels calls them Reds and Blues, together to understand and respect each other in a way that has seemingly been lost today. So I think both sides are really important. And what I would encourage folks listening, and I'm certainly happy if you want to contact me after the call, I can help direct you. But there's a whole infrastructure. I think you mentioned this, Piper, at the beginning. There's a whole infrastructure of reform going on both sides of that balance sheet. And I think more people need to get engaged, because if too many people, especially private sector leaders, which many folks again on this call might be, if too many people have their heads in the sand or
Mhm.
are afraid to engage because it's like touching something radioactive, then the extremes will continue to dominate. So the call to action for those on the call today is figure out a way to plug in. Now, I say this with some cognizance that the folks who are on the call probably are plugged in. So one of the questions is, how do we get to so many Americans who care about the stakes but don't understand how to get involved? And so that's also about trying to expand our own personal circles and engaging more broadly in the organizations we run, in the businesses we run, but figuring out fora to engage people in these two types of change, I think, is really important.
Yep. Our newsletter next Friday will focus explicitly on this, all the different things that are going on around the country, the democracy ecosystem, and ways to be involved. So stay
Right.
tuned for that. am curious when you mentioned business, I think looking at our different careers, they probably couldn't be more different. I have been in the nonprofit space for forever, and you have been, leading major corporations. One of the primary values, our first value, in fact, at Stories Change Power is decency. And it's wanting to shift from the compete to win and, winner loser type mindset into treating everybody first and foremost with decency. I feel like that's a little bit in conflict with some of the business compete to win, beat your competitors type approach. And I'm curious how you reconcile those in the world of politics. I mean, there's a space where there are winners and losers. You win re-election or you don't. So how do we, is there space to bring in that decency, even as the reality of the system is there's times where we still are competitive?
So competition of both ideas and business products and services is a wonderful thing because it's what drives innovation and change. The problem is, in fact, not that we have competition, but we no longer have competition. So the system has become rigged economically so that in almost every industry, there are a handful of large companies that control the space and write the rules. So we don't have competition anymore. In the competition for ideas, we're all afraid to speak. So we can't share because it either what will be canceled or demonized or will be called woke or what. So too many, we can't honestly have an exchange of ideas. So we're losing that competition as well. So let me just challenge you. Of course, in business is about competition, but when you really think about it, I would say both in our capitalist economy today, which has gone off the rails, we've lost the power of competition, as well as in how we share ideas as a democracy. So, democratic form of government is difficult, but it's epistemologically superior, meaning that what I mean by that is it's a way to grow knowledge. In an aristocracy, decrees get handed down and you follow them. In a democratic form of government, the idea is to listen and learn. So that's the concept, which we're not doing anymore. Now, so that's one answer to the question. I think the other key answer about business people. So why do I focus so much on private sector leaders in this? Well, it turns out that we talked a lot about those three elements of the secret sauce. Some of in our society, the people who use those three elements most effectively every day are C-level business people, in my view, because to make their businesses work, they need to use data as the center of their problem solving, use empirical analysis, hear multiple points of view, suppliers, customers, etc., employees, and compromise to get stuff done. So the people who, the other part of the paradox of the frustrated majority is the people most attuned with the skills to use the secret sauce are also those who are silenced by this crazy political environment. So they're afraid to speak out. And that's why I speak to two audiences mostly, business leaders and students, who I both think are crucial if we're gonna make headway here.
Yeah. I want to encourage folks, I could ask questions for hours, but this is your webinar too. So please, where you've got questions, put those in the Q&A and we'll get to those. I wonder, Seth, I want to dig a little bit deeper into, I mean, I really appreciate the notion where it may seem invisible, but there is a competition for ideas. Do we want it to be, our world to be focused on people or just profits, on, on the well-being of all of us or the well-being of just a few? And what do you see as the role of business now? And I asked that, I mean, that there's a fascinating podcast that came out recently, talking about the how many swings we saw from 2020, and then very rapidly where there was the backlash, and it seemed like businesses were all on board with certain things, and then when they started to become woke, then they pushed back the other way. That's a world that is very unfamiliar to me. What do you see? If you could tell all business leaders, I guess you are telling, what are you telling all business leaders to do in these circumstances?
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that because of the nature of how corrupt our electoral politics have become, businesses are certainly involved in government because they lobby all the time. And in fact, it's the lobbyists who work for companies that write the laws. That's where we're at this point. So it's not like business is not involved in government. What what I tell business people is that our economy, which has been driven off the rails in my perspective. And by the way, there's a great book about this. A guy, it's called the Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which is a lot about how both the democracy and capitalism have become bastardized in a huge way. This has happened again. Talk about history. It's happened many times in our past. It was the Farmers Alliance in the 1890s, which was a populist movement that reacted to farmers no longer being able to survive against big oil, steel, and railroads. That ultimately led to the Progressive Era, where people like Teddy Roosevelt realized that we had to change the rules in the capitalist model. And that happened again with FDR and again with later on. So my point is that every era we've had to kind of correct. And I could go through many examples, about where the capitalism is broken. But the whole point of competition is the idea of being able to unleash innovation in a huge way. Both our capitalist model is supposed to do that, as well as our competition for ideas, new ideas. So I could spend a lot of time on this. Let me give one example. This is where government's not playing the role it's supposed to play. I mean, if you go back to Adam Smith and all the arguments about why capitalism is a wonderful model, it's based on this following concept: that two private participants in a market, by competing, or a handful, by competing with each other, they strive in their own interest to produce products and services which consumers value, which create consumer surplus. But if there's no competition, imagine watching a race where one party rigged the rules. We're in a capitalism today where the rules are completely rigged, because the incumbents in the field, whether it's the oil companies or the finance industry, is the greatest example of this. If you look into this, they write the rules that we're supposed to live by, and what they do is they basically they obviate the role the federal government has in making sure the rules are fair. So we have there's plenty of information as a public good. There's plenty of things that consumers can't know. So we have things like the FDA or the FTC, but those have been co-opted by interest. I'll give one example. As a business person, when I was running Proactiv, which was the biggest acne brand, we used to spend about $4 million a week on advertising. Every single ad that my teams were responsible for creating had to be approved, whether it was print or TV or digital, by both the FDA for claims against acne, because there were a set of particular claims you can say and those you can't, and from the FTC on marketing practices. So the idea is the government's supposed to referee. The government has a role in a capitalist economy to make sure the infrastructure is there and the rules are followed. We've obviated that. And I've lost my train of thought, but that's one key reason why it's not working. Remind me of the question again, Piper. Sorry.
The role of business and what you would say.
Thank you.
What should they be doing now?
So what business needs to do is get involved in this process that they're not involved in, which is this fear of helping enforce the secret sauce and the magic formula. Now, what I do concretely is when I meet with business folks, I tell them they can get engaged in this important work, both on the structural side and on the mindset side, without having to touch a third rail. Because the business folks don't know there's this entire reform space where we're trying to. So I bring money from business to the reform space. So if you don't want to take a loud voice on this, for example, Mr. CEO, how about supporting groups like Represent Us or Open Primaries, groups that are working on these issues without, no one needs to know that you're supporting these movements. How about number two, plugging into them? So if you're in a state where there are closed primaries, you get involved with local legislature on maybe changing that or changing the gerrymandering that's involved in your state. So get involved in the process. Yeah. The third way is in the mindset side, as a leader, you set the example for all of your employees about respectful dialogue and difference. So if you think that as a leader that you're not being modeled, you're missing a huge opportunity. So those are three ways, I think, Piper, that business
Yeah.
leaders get involved, and that's my goal.
Yeah, and it's a perfect segue into a question that we have. I want to note really quickly, though, it's fascinating, right? Because that $4 million budget for 1 week of advertising is more than some nonprofits have ever seen. So there's a lot of potential for that support. It strikes me too, where there's the regulation, and some people might say, oh, but freedom of speech, this is our First Amendment, but there are those limitations. You know, all of our rights we can look at in isolation, but it's when they come together that you need folks. You know, we don't want freedom of speech to be so free that we're buying products that are damaging us and damaging our health. So lots to unpack there. But I want to move to the question here from Jared. Thank you for this. He says, speaking of employers, how could bridging practitioners best talk with employers about the opportunities provided by empathy building bridging experiences for their workforce? I love this. I want to hire you already. It's an easy pitch to faith communities and campuses, but less so for profit-based organizations. What's the business case in there, Seth?
So the business case that I often raise, and this is a great question, Jared, thank you, is that the type of competition for ideas that we're talking about and being open to fundamentally supports business. It's what makes business work. That's why you innovate. And, you know, the idea is to lead by example for employees. Unfortunately, we no longer have civic education the way we used to have, K through 12. But to make it very clear about how respectful disagreement works and not tolerate. You know, when I sit down to an argument with somebody and they start bringing ad hominem attacks into this, or they start using what I call the language of digital tweeting, I don't participate in that. I mean, that's not the purpose of why I want to talk to people about it. I want to hear your ideas and engage on it in a respectful way. So I think most of the things that we say online, we wouldn't say in the face of someone. So what the CEO can do, or the SVP of marketing, is to encourage their employees, just like they need to share ideas respectfully for business solutions. That same model actually has served us very well civically for hundreds of years when we've used it. And so I think that's the point, is I think having employers really reinforce the respectful dialogue and disagreement framework for business innovation needs to be extended beyond that, and to not tolerate in the business environment some of the stuff that goes on in the way we talk about to our fellow citizens in other form.
Yeah. We're getting a little short on time, so I'll skip. I wanted to read, there's a passage on page 40 of the book. I'll try to just summarize it instead. You talk about value creation and how there were major shifts over the course of history. I'm thinking about where we are now, and where just this year alone, seeing the need for firefighters. We need school teachers. We need, folks who are doing traditional jobs. And yet there's a lot of pressure to be influencers and to see ourselves, whether we think about this consciously or not, as consumers. And thinking we're only as good as the goods that we buy. What are your thoughts now on value creation? Where are we in the course of this longer arc of history?
Great question. I'll say this. I mentioned before this economic model of neoliberalism that we've both left and right presidents and administrations have followed religiously. What we've lost there is the value of producing things as opposed to consuming things as a society. So we've become a consumer society to a degree that's very unhealthy, in my view. There is a great value in making things. So let's take in a rural area that was focused on manufacturing, when we thought in the 90s and early 2000s that outsourcing was great because we were getting those products made for less money by producing them in China. That was the economic model. What we failed to recognize is that there's incredible value in working class Americans producing something every day and participating in society. And that if you take that away as a value, and if you only focus on the economic costs, this tremendous thing, you're missing the tree through the forest. So what's the right word?
Forest for the yep.
Yeah, right. So that's an example of where the value the value of production in an economy or a society has been lost, in my view. I'll give you another example. There's been so much written about, climate change and the concern about it. From an economic perspective, there's a very simple solution of course, the special interests have fought against, which is that if every producer in the economy had to be responsible for the carbon they emit as an externality, which is what we call in economics, they would then have to pay for the carbon they emit, and so would therefore start competing with each other on how to produce products with less carbon. So in other words, there's an economic solution for this if we could wrestle power away from big oil and energy, that we almost had cap and trade in carbon many times, but it's never passed because of the corruption in the economic model. So, many things, economics doesn't solve everything, but economics has a way of ensuring that values are part of the profit maximization equation. So if companies had to pay for the carbon they emit, then they would innovate and make money by lowering the amount of carbon they emit. So there are tools that economists debate all the time of how to address these things that we're not using.
I know we're a little over time. We have one more question that I can't resist asking. I also see one, Paula, about civic ed. We'll address that in the follow-up and in newsletter. But Ginger asks, some authoritarianism experts I follow are indicating we are beyond the tipping point and are looking at years, decades to overcome. If this is the case, do you think economic boycotts would drive corporations to raise their collective voices?
Thank you, Ginger. Unfortunately, I am also becoming increasingly concerned that the authoritarians are winning today. That it's very, they found a way to control the narrative. And this is true domestically as well as internationally. If you look at other countries where, because of the preponderance of information out there, it's easier today for authoritarians to kind of define the narrative. So I think they're winning in general. Now, I don't know if the solution to this, to your point, Ginger, is going to take generations, which is why I speak to young people. So we are not going to see this solved in our lifetime. The question is, which way are we pointing? Are we working towards solution? Are we working towards healing these rifts or not? And I think we're working further away from healing them today, and we've got to turn the tide. But a healthy society, in the way that our founders, let's say, envisioned it, is going to take time, and it's a generational thing. So I'm not sure if like a simple solution like economic boycotts is really going to help. I mean, maybe it's part of the solution, but this is going to take fundamental change at the structural level, as I mentioned, and the mindset level. And it will take at least a generation or two if we're going to save our republic. But we have to move back towards the solution space, in my view, again, by embracing the secret sauce.
So this may not be fair, but so are you saying thumbs up or thumbs down to or it may just be complicated, but I'm feeling a little unsatisfied by.
Yeah. Well, so it's, I'm right. I try to be an optimist. And so let me tell you the two things that give me hope, Piper. The one is how big this reform community has become, that you and I are both involved in. It's really at the grassroots level. It's gaining a lot of momentum. And that's very rewarding. The other thing that gives me hope is when I speak to students, which I do often, is that I think they recognize how much our generation has failed in some ways and are ready to approach things differently, are ready for change. So that gives me hope. But I also don't want to be naive. I think that we're not moving right now. We're not moving in the right direction. We continued to tolerate a corrupt political economic form. We're not willing to change how we have aligned, how we've allowed economic power to run the gamut, to make the rules, and we're continuing to not require different business models in media, for example, that would value things like accuracy and truth. So we've got to start addressing these problems, and we're not going to address them by the people who are screaming today. We're going to address them when pragmatic centrists center left, center right, are willing to compromise and talk through solutions. One of the greatest examples today is the whole immigration framework. We scream about immigration; it's like the loudest issue. But if immigration is a very complex set of problems, and it requires many things like secure borders and a better process for asylum, etc. If we've had 4 or 5 times in the last 10 years a comprehensive immigration proposal sitting in Congress, it's never passed.
Yep.
So we prefer to scream about it as opposed to solve it. It's going to take compromise. But immigration's fundamentally helped shape this country. It's really important. Immigration out of control can be very detrimental. So it's not right or wrong. It's about fixing the framework. But most of us are we're too quick to bite the bullet and be scared by it or react to it emotionally, as opposed to taking the problem on headfold. I think that's one example.
Yeah, and I appreciate Ginger notes. It could be a tool in the toolbox, and
Yes.
yes, I mean our framework, the 9 rights, talks about the right framing, right actor, message, messenger, and so forth. And I think seeing it in this bigger picture, rather than, as you're saying, Seth, just screaming, even as there's a big temptation, and it's understandable where we're getting so frustrated with where we are, but taking that more practical, pragmatic, as unexciting as that might be, and it's not going to get you all the clicks on all the social media platforms, but it could actually be effective. So
Thank you.
thank you for the extra time.
Sure. Please reach out, folks. I think you have my email. My email is seth@sethdavidradable.com. I'm happy to hear from folks. I think it's pretty clear from this call that I didn't leave my CEO job to do this to make a fortune. This for me is a passion that I really care about. And so I'm very interested if I can be helpful in your communities to engage.
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Seth. And we'll include your email in the follow-up. Thank you, everyone, I know we went a bit over time, but as you note in the chat, this is such an important conversation. This is an ongoing series. We'll post a bit in the chat as well. You can learn more about the book. You can also register next month. We'll be talking with Professor Lorelei Kelly about modernizing Congress and how to have more using the tools that we have available to have them hear from us more effectively. There will also be, as you drop off of the webinar, a poll that pops up. Please be a helper. That takes about 15 seconds, and your feedback is incredibly helpful as we plan this monthly series. Again, Seth, thank you so much for not just your time today, but all the time that went into creating this amazing book, which folks should check out. Have a wonderful weekend. Take good care. Be well. Do good. And we'll be back in touch soon.